Uh, Thank you, colleagues. So let me briefly introduce the panelists, today's panelists. So the first one is the Saurabh Kaura. He is our climate investment specialist from private sector division. And similarly, Ruth Kuzman is the co-portfolio manager from the UNEP. And the third speaker is from the Oscar Guevara from the CAF. So the colleagues will be presenting later on. So for the participants on site and remote participants online are invited to submit their comments and questions through the Huba app during the session, and then we'll take it up and also address to the appropriate colleagues so that they can take it over. So with that one, let me briefly go into the overview presentation on that one. So the presentation that I'm going to do it, overview presentation, that will give the overall the context, and then I'll briefly talk about the paradigm shifting pathways, and then we'll talk about the case studies and also the projects that is going to be delivered by our colleagues, the speakers, and then we'll also briefly touch upon the financing paradigm, the pathways. So the context, so let me briefly start with the very global context. Let's see. If you look at this graph, because the global emissions are contributing approximately 24% of the total greenhouse emissions from fuel consumption, and significant increase in emission is from the road vehicles. That is why we are now facing this the current the situation for both passengers and the freight for the last 2 decades. And the car ownership is continuously going up, and it's going up by 80%, 87% in Asia, 58% in Latin American countries from 2005 to 2015. And the transport CO2 emission trend is in most of the developed countries are the greatest emitter per capita, and significant increase in emission from road vehicles for both passengers and freight for the past 2 decades. And if we look at it, the car ownership, as I told you already, because it's going up in every continent and in every country, and it keeps on going. So if we do not do anything and keep it as a business as usual, I think this is going to increase. So the reason that way we are trying to do some interventions to limit this increase and also to overcome this issue is about to shift to the public transport. And about the developing country context, because this is very critical for access to education, the transport, and the mobility, for the economic opportunities and health. And if you look at the figure, because the mobility gap, developing country for RTR average is 4 when global average is 32. So it shows why it is very critical in the developing countries. And the low emission and the climate resilient transport enables the sustainable development goals. It touches upon the various goals. Goal number 3, which is good health and well-being, that supports to the mobility and also to the accessibility to the good health that results into the well-being, and also about the gender equality, because the transport interventions that we are currently considering or we are discussing now are more focused also on the gender equality, and also the goal number 9, industry innovation and infrastructure. It also contemplates on the goal number 11 about the sustainable cities and communities. That's where we are concentrating at the moment. It's not only in the major cities or the major capital, we are also focusing on the secondary cities and also the emerging cities, so that we can have the great the balance within the cities and the interventions. So with these all the issues and the ongoing activities, if you look at the emissions and the financing gap, the travel demand for the passenger freight to double by 2050 from 2015. That is the reason why we need to think about the intervention that we are going to limit. The one is about the how can we limit the travels so that the greenhouse gas emissions can be a little bit reduced. And travel demand for passengers and the flight to be doubled from 2015. So that requires additional 25 million kilometers of new paved lanes and 335,000 of kilometers of rail from 2010 levels. So that shows the impact and also the necessity of this, how this is going to increase and how this is going to be a challenge for us, for all of the colleagues or the sector specialists who are working on this sector. And the transport CO2 emissions need to drop from 8 gigaton to 2 to 3 gigaton by 2050 to keep the temperature rise below 1.5 degrees Celsius, which is one of the major the milestone. And if you look at the financing gap to reach that milestone is estimated to be about USD 2 to 3 trillion per year by 2050 to meet this 1.5 degrees Celsius scenario. So having all these contexts in our side, so what we have done is we have recently completed our transport sector guide, which will be the guiding document for us to consider for our upcoming projects or ongoing projects as well. And what are the major the theory or the major the principle that we are going to adopt in the transport sector guide? Let me briefly highlight on that. So the major principle is about the avoid, shift, and improve, and also about the paradigm shift, shifting pathways. There are four prolonged approach to paradigm shift. One is about the transformational planning, because one of the major issue or one of the very guiding principle is how do we carry out the planning? Is it the very generic planning or the planning that we are continuing at the moment? But what do we feel is that if we do the integrated planning, that would obviously help. It's about the land use planning and also the mobility planning. If we can combine both of these, that will have a greater impact. And also the catalyzing innovation. So how do we catalyze the innovations? Because if we continue the business as usual, the challenge will remain as it is. So we need to also catalyze the innovation and the mobilizing finance. It's, as I already discussed about the financing gap, it's a huge financing gap. So how do we mobilize or how do we tap the different financing, the available financing from the different the sources? That is also one of the issues. And also about the knowledge management to align finance and the development. So there are three the paradigm shifting pathways that is being considered integrated into the recently developed the transport sector guide. Pathway number one is about accelerating the shift to low emission public transport. That's the avoid and shift. And the second pathway is about rapidly electrifying the transport system, because if we want to shift from the current the focus on the private the vehicles, then if it switch on to the public transport, so how do we improve this public transportation system? Are we going to use the same the fossil fuel based public transportation system, or are we going to switch over to the more climate friendly, climate resilient, the electrifying the transport system? So that is the another paradigm shift that is being considered under this transport sector guide. And the pathway number three is supporting the scale up of new generation zero emission fuels. So it's kind of an innovation. So how do we consider this into our project development and the origination of the projects? And obviously, I mean, there are several barriers to the financing paradigm shifting pathways. And mainly those the barriers are, the first is the high policy risk. If you look at the different countries, I mean, the policy risk is always there, even though the policy or the rules and regulations are being developed, but the enforcement and the implementation is always been a challenge. And particularly for this kind of the new technology, where the experience is still expanding and it's still going up. So this has always been a very, very challenging, because many things are still going up, the innovations are still continuing, and this new technology is also emerging. So that is one of the main barrier. And also about the high institutional risks. So it's more about insufficient institutional capacity in respect to planning, developing, and implementing a long-term strategy for low emission transport. And the high technology risks, because now this the vehicles are of the new technology, and there is a risk because it's changing, or it's emerging quite rapidly. Because if you look at the electric vehicle that was there since in last 5-6 years, and if you compare it to now, it's changing a lot. That the technology is changing a lot, and it is expected that it will keep on changing because it's a new technology. So we need to also take this into consideration. And the high revenue risk, mostly about the high revenues we can control and we can balance about this high revenue risk. So let me now go a little bit in talking about these these 3 different pathways. So let me go with the first one, with the pathway number 1. That is about the accelerating the shift to low emission public transport. And for this one, the major barriers are, as all we know, because in many countries, still the mobility is more focused on the private the vehicles. So there is a strong culture around the occupancy vehicles and subsidization of the cars and the roads. So still people are not very much willing to switch over to the public transport because it's very comfortable. And in some of the countries, the public transportation system as such is also not very well designed, and the services are not up to the mark. So there is still a very strong culture. The barrier is there. And another is the limited or poor quality existing public transport infrastructure in terms of services, in terms of reliability, and so on and so forth. And also the limited understanding, experience of integrated public transport, non-motorized transport, and the others. Because when we talk about the public transportation system, another issue that we need to also take into consideration is the last mile connectivity, because we cannot force people to switch from the private transport to the public transport if there is no well connectivity is established, and most particularly about this last mile connectivity. So if people needs to walk after taking the trip, then they may not be willing to transform to the public transportation system. And potential high impact action is it's more about integrated planning and programming, and the catalyzing innovation, mobilizing large scale finance, and the knowledge management. So these are the different the issues that we need to also take into consideration. So I will not go into detail because our speakers will be highlighting about this through their the implemented projects or the future projects. So I think I will leave it these issues for that. And the pathway number 2 is rapidly electrifying transport system. This is what we are doing at the moment, and this is the focus for all of us in GCF1, as well as it will be focused on the GCF2. And what are the major barriers for this? The rapid electrifying the transport. So the first is the depending on the energy sector and electricity pricing volatility. Because in most of the countries, if you still look at the energy, the supply of the energy is not adequate enough for the operation of the electric vehicle. So that needs to be handled very well. In most of the developing countries, I mean, there are still scarce of the energy that is being generated. So it's always been one of the challenges for the electrifying the transportation system. And is about the other challenges is about the charging infrastructure and the supply chain the deficit. As this charging infrastructure or the infrastructure for the charging system is still evolving, and it's evolving quite fast. So there is still a challenge, because to provide the adequate the infrastructure for the charging system is not very much adequately provided in all the countries. So it's still going up. So unless and until it is easily accessible, that is one of the barriers for to people to move from the fossil fuel vehicle to the electric vehicle. Because if you have to wait for a very long to charge your vehicle, it's very obvious. I mean, people will not feel very comfortable to switch over to that one. And I myself is one of the experience of that one, because I started using my electric vehicle, but to charge it, you have to keep it for the overnight, whole night. And sometimes the charging is not also very consistent. So sometimes the energy gets fluctuated and it doesn't get charged. So these kind of the challenges or the issues still remains, and we need to tackle up this. But what we believe is that the technology is improving, and within a couple of years, I think the new technology will definitely emerge, and there would be a lot of the simplification on this charging infrastructure as well. And the other barrier that is still prevail is the technology maturity and the performance of the battery operated electric vehicles. So the performance of the vehicles are also different at the different scale. And the fourth and the most important is the high upfront cost, because particularly for the public transport, if you compare to the fossil fuel vehicle and the electric vehicles, the upfront cost is very, very high. And that is one of the reasons why the operators are not very much willing to switch to the electric vehicle, because the upfront cost is very high. And the third pathway is the supporting scale up of the new zero emissions fuels. And the barriers for this are infrastructure deficit, obviously, as to the other barriers, the other pathways, and need for restructuring. So we need to restructure how do we improve this infrastructure deficit, and the underdeveloped supply chains that also needs to be tackled up, and we need to also take into consideration of that. And the concerns of the competition with the food supply, demand for new generation and biofuels, and also with the concerns with the environment effects of the new low emissions fuel systems. So these are the major highlights of the transport sector guide. So this is going to be finalized and approved very soon in our upcoming board. So now this the version of the transport sector guide is accessible through our website. You can reach it out to this as well. And once it is approved, I think it is publicly available. So, and this would be the guiding document for us to develop our transport sector projects. So with this one, I'll stop it here. And now then we'll move into our panelist session. So first, let me invite Saurabh for your the session. Thank you so much, Saurabh.
Thanks, Naresh. Yeah, good afternoon all. My name is Saurabh and I am a part of the private sector facility in the GCF. I'll be talking about a program which we recently approved. It was the first program. It was the first program in the e-mobility space of the GCF. It was the first private sector program which was entirely targeting the transport sector, the most underrepresented sector in the portfolio. And it was our first program with Macquarie Asset Management. So this is a financing take on the EV as a sector, electric mobility as a sector, and the approach that we followed in this program is fairly unique. And I'll take you through the approach and the context and the background of this funding proposal. So the program was developed. The context behind this proposal was the program was that road transport as a sector contributed enormously to the national emissions. About around 13% of the emissions came from the road transport sector in India, and on an absolute level, this was more than the total emissions of many large European economies. And what had happened was, since 1990, when the economy liberalized, the emissions were increasing. With increasing urbanization, increasing uptake of vehicles, the emissions were showing an increasing trend. On the other hand, since the country depended mostly on oil imports to meet its energy needs, there was a concern from the government that we have to be energy secure. We have to have control over the sources of energy, and therefore there was a push from the government to transition towards e-mobility. The policy push, in fact, started way back in 2016-17 when the government came up with subsidies or direct incentives for operators of EVs, and over a period of 2016-17 to 2021, there were many policies introduced by the government, and these policies also brought in a bit of standardization because electric charging was a new sector and standardization was needed. So government played its part. It also came up with a production-linked incentive scheme where the government was ready to provide incentives for OEMs to manufacture in India. And last but not the least was increasing penetration of RE. So as we all know, the grid of India is dominated by coal. But in the last decade, a lot of private sector investment has happened into renewable energy, and the grid is slowly decarbonizing. And one important fact of this decarbonization story is the participation of the local financial ecosystem. So, domestic banks, domestic institutional investors have participated in the renewable energy, and that was one of the factors why we've seen increasing investments in renewable energy. Now, when we looked at EV, the story was different. The EV sector was probably where the renewable energy sector was 15 years back. The banking sector or the financial sector, although India has a large vehicle financing market, but when it came to EVs, there were certain risks involved with EVs. The biggest risk was a residual value risk. So usually vehicle financing is done on an asset financing basis where you look at the value of the asset today, you look at the value of the asset 3 years from now, and in case a default is to happen and the vehicles is to be repossessed, you look at what's the loss that as a bank or as a lender you need to carry in your books. The problem with EVs was because there was no secondary market, there was no resale market as such because the market itself had not picked up. There were no data points, and that led to a difficulty in the banking community to price the risk. So what should be the pricing of an EV loan or a loan to an operator in the EV operating in the EV sector? So while on one hand the financial ecosystem was mature enough to provide financing to RE, although it took time, it was mature enough to provide financing to vehicles. EV as a segment had unique barriers, unique challenges, and it would have taken 5 to 7 years for the market to develop on its own, and for these data points to be there. And this was one of the barriers that we noticed in the market. The third barrier that we actually, when we studied the market, especially the vehicle financing market, there was no leasing, as a solution. So when we looked at EVs, the biggest risk is the residual value risk. And by providing an operating lease, the residual risk is shifted from the lessee or the operator to the lessor. But unfortunately, the market didn't have leasing. There was leasing happening, but the market penetration was very low. And leasing as especially operating lease as a solution was, addressed some of the risks, but banks were not really active in this market. Last but not the least was a lack of risk appetite. And this mainly came from, an increasing cost of equity, especially in the NBFI sector, and investors wanting to invest equity into non-banking financial institutions were looking at a high cost of capital. And, to merge that with an emerging or a nascent market such as EVs, the cost of equity increased. The cost of equity that was being expected was quite significant. And the reason why I'm putting stress on this is because when you look at conventional vehicle and when you look at an EV, the main barrier is the cost gap. And going beyond upfront costs, when you look at the total cost of ownership, the cost of owning an EV, which is the interest rate that you pay to your bank, the cost of equity, it has a very significant impact on the cost of ownership. So the moment cost of equity goes up, the moment cost of capital goes up, the total cost of ownership of an EV goes up, and therefore, as a consumer, you're more inclined to buy a conventional vehicle. So against this backdrop, the program was developed. The main, although this diagram is a bit complicated, so the main design of the program was to seed a platform, seed a leasing cum financing platform, with the mandate, and the platform's mandate will be only to do financing and leasing of EVs plus other sectors. One unique approach that I forgot to mention here was that we've looked at this proposal not only from a vehicle financing perspective but from a value chain perspective. So there is capital needed for setting up charging infrastructure. There is capital needed for supporting new business models like battery swapping stations, but expecting existing financial institutions and banks to take those risks will take some time. And what we want to do with this program is to accelerate that, not to wait till 5-7 years, till the market develops on its own, but to be the first mover and take risks now. So what we are doing in this program is GCF is providing equity of $200 million, which would be pooled into a vehicle. This equity will be junior equity, and the main reason is to crowd in commercial investors who will look at commercial rates of return. So GCF equity of $200 million will be blended with commercial equity of $205 million. And this equity will then be invested into a platform, a greenfield financing platform, financing leasing platform in India. And the platform will have its own, own management team, its own governance, its own board. And this platform will then provide financing solutions. One of the other things that we wanted to accomplish, by setting up a platform was the market is rapidly changing. So whereas, an operating lease may work today, it may not work through 3 years or 4 years down the line because the market will develop. So we wanted to create a platform that is nimble enough to come up with new differentiated products as the market needs. And this is what we are trying to do with this. The total equity, as I said, is $405 million. This equity will be further leveraged, at least 3 to 4 times, depending upon the underlying portfolio that it will develop. And this debt mobilization that will happen at the platform level could take, could be from the local markets or could be from the offshore markets. So with this structure, we are trying to mobilize risk-averse, commercial capital, which is looking at equity investments, but is targeting high returns. We are looking at mobilizing domestic markets who may not want to take risk directly by lending, but through an institution that provides an equity buffer, and possibly capital markets, because if depending upon the rating that the platform gets, it could also be look at raising fundings from the capital markets. So this is the solution, and this was a unique program. This is probably one of the first programs where GCF is seeding a platform, and we hope to do this, in the future as well. That would be my time. Thank you. Over to you, Manish.
Thank you, Saurabh. I think this is for the presentation or the overview on the program that is recently been approved, right? Because I think it was approved in the last board. And this is one of the very interesting project. So we look forward for the implementation and also the lesson learned from this project so that we can also scale it up and also replicable in the other countries. So with that, we'll go to the second panelist or the speakers. So let me invite with that one with the Rohit from the UNEP. Thank you so much. Yeah.
Thank you very much. My name is Ruth Colt. I work for the United Nations Environment Program, and I'm the co-portfolio manager, can you hear me, of the GEF and the GCF operations on mitigation. I'm here representing the team that works on electric mobility and transport in UNEP. I'm not the person who works on it, and I'll try my best to represent them and to respond to your questions towards the end. I think that both Naresh and Saurabh make very important points about the challenges that we have ahead of us on the electrification of the fleets. And without trying to talk too much about that, Let me get that. So we know that if we want to reach our commitments, the IPCC report to the climate agreement says that we really need to change the fleet by 2035 or 2050, 100% electric vehicles. And this is a major challenge because today electric vehicles, either on sales or on stock market, is between 9 to 12%. So this is a mega change that needs to happen. And for us to be able to do that, there are many barriers and there are many pathways. And I think that you described quite well, Naresh, the challenges on electrification. But when we go to the ground, as you were talking about what India needs, then we see the amount of challenge that needs and that is ahead of us. There are some key trends. So just to add up to what was being said, we know that in the next 50 years, no, but in the next 30 years, we will be adding 1 billion vehicles to the fleet. It's a lot of vehicles, and many of these vehicles will continue to be conventional vehicles. Many of these vehicles will be electric vehicles, but the majority of the vehicles will be added in low and middle income countries, in non-OECD countries. So in Africa, in Latin America, and in Asia. And this is gonna cause a lot of problems in the next 20 years because there is gonna be a major influx of cars that will have been sold. They're conventional cars and will have to be exported. Not will have to be exported, but will be exported to low and middle income countries. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that because it's part of the puzzle on how we're going to actually accelerate electrification in the most sustainable way and not lose the benefits of electrification in the developed world and then a shift of the problem to the developing countries. We know that in 2050, two out of the 3 vehicles will be in low and middle income countries. And the turnover of a conventional car in low and middle income countries is 20 years. So we have a problem ahead of us as well. The emissions of the transport sector are growing faster than any other sector. So I think all the points that lead to us, not here, but here. Okay. There is also an issue happening in Europe. Most of the producers of cars have committed not to produce any more electric vehicles in Europe or in North America or in Japan or in Korea, but they haven't made this commitment in Latin America, in Asia, or in Africa. We also see that there is a very low regulatory scheme, as you can see in the map, in countries where there are not sufficient strict import restrictions to avoid this massive flow of used vehicles. And there is a need to reinforce these regulations on fuel efficiency, carbon emissions, and age of cars that are being imported to avoid this flux. And this is, I think, part of what we're trying to do when we work with a more integrated policy framework in the transport sector to make these regulatory regimes a bit more robust to avoid this shift of used vehicles in the willingness to change to electric vehicles. Another important aspect is the recycling. If the export countries in the north, in Europe, in North America, or in Japan, will put also export restrictions, they will scrap and recycle the conventional vehicles and recover a lot of aluminum, cobalt, and lithium. Whereas if they actually export, this is going to be a problem that the developing countries will face. So this is just to actually make the point of the global trade in used vehicles. As you see in the yellow are cars that have been exported from Europe to other parts of the world. And this is mainly due to the side of the part of the vehicle that you actually drive. And Japan has exported a lot to Southeast Africa and Europe to the north and west of Africa. and etc. So it's a very important, I think, aspect and report that UNEP has put forward. And I invite you to take a look at the report, because I think it shows a lot of these movements of the used vehicles, which I think, and in UNEP we think as well, is a problem that needs to be tackled together with the shift to electric mobility. So what do we think could be the way forward? We believe that there is a very important need to have export restrictions in OECD countries, and also focus on circularity of metals. It's much easier to actually regulate maybe 20 or 30 countries than regulate 120 countries. But in any case, there is also a need to have import restrictions of used fleets in non-OECD countries if you don't want to lose the gains on the shift to electric mobility. So we need policy frameworks that actually restrict low quality vehicles or vehicles that are too old or do not have specific filter certificates. And it's very important, as we heard here, to focus on the shift part. UNEP fully supports that. And if we don't focus on shifting, the modal shift to public transport, we're not going to achieve what we want to achieve. But to shift to public transport, we have to make the way in a sustainable way, as Naresh was telling us. We have to have bus rapid transit systems that actually can be accessible by feeder lines and last mile connectivity with non-motorized transport. We need this infrastructure to be resilient. We need it to be green, and we need it to be properly electrified. The problem that we're facing is that most of the countries, especially in Africa, are already developing their BRT systems now. Business as usual. Cities are extremely congested and polluted in the capitals that we see in Africa and in Asia. And if this shift to the BRT, which is less expensive than metro systems, is not done in a way that allows it to be fully electrified, this infrastructure is going to be there for many years, and we will we'll lose the opportunity to shift the public fleet of electric buses, the buses to be electric. We also need to continue to promote non-motorized transport. It's extremely important to retain the people who already walk and cycle and will not move to the used vehicles that will be less expensive than actually the electric vehicles. Not because the people don't deserve to have a better transportation mode, but because we collectively need to ensure that the non-motorized transport, the walking, the cycling is safe, is secure. It's something that does not actually bring a lot of financial strains to the livelihoods of people who cannot afford to have either a car or walk to or public transportation. And I think that we heard this morning when Kara was talking about the 2- and 3-wheelers and how 2- and 3-wheelers can actually really begin to pave the way for actually the change. 2- and 3-wheelers can be charged at home at night more quickly than the cars, and hopefully they won't face the same challenges that Naresh, you were facing in your actually charging. And 2- and 3-wheelers also are, we heard it's a resilient change. If you have a 2- and 3-wheeler and there is a disaster, you can actually continue to use it, whereas public transportation and other modes of transport, you cannot. If if we travel around, we see that 2- and 3-wheelers are actually taxis. They actually substitute or help public transportation. They're less expensive than actually taking the bus. And therefore, we need to really support that, because the 2- and 3-wheelers will really pave the way for a much more robust, complete supply chain on electric mobility. We need to focus on private fleets, as we heard from Saurabh, and in India, that is, capture fleets are important, but also electric buses. But the problem that we face, and the biggest problem, is the high upfront costs. Because at the end of the day, who is going to finance the differential cost? And when the government needs to do a public bidding and the differential cost is 300,000 or 200,000 or 100,000 per bus, and we need to buy 100 buses on 300 buses, then it becomes a very big issue. And we need to sort out this problem. And that's why we're beginning to discuss how to actually structure a project to be able to to address this issue of the high upfront cost. I see that you have addressed in a very interesting way in India, and I think we have to think about other interesting ways of how to do that. In UNEP, we have many programs actually that talk to these different parts of the solution, and we also focus on the avoid, shift, and improve approach. So I think on the avoid and trying to actually do modal shift, integrated urban planning, land use planning, mobility planning is extremely important, and we lead a program together with many other partners that is called Urban Shift, where we actually tackle that. In terms of walking and cycling, UNEP has been working on the Share the Road initiative, which actually is an initiative promoting, mostly in Africa, that countries and municipalities, they commit when they're going to develop a new road infrastructure or pave or repave a new road or change a new big infrastructure in terms of pavement, that part of that investment is locked to non-motorized transport to retain actually the people who walk and cycle on the road. And that's why it's called Share the Road, because actually the people are using this road. When it's paved, then they are moved out of that. And if you don't leave the lanes for people to walk and cycle, it's going to be extremely much more dangerous because the velocity, the speed is going to be higher. We have also programs on global fuel efficiency and economy and partnerships for clean vehicles. And we have a global immobility program, which I want to talk a little bit more about. The Share the Road initiative that I just want to remind us is very interesting, because when you begin to look into the statistics in Africa specifically, you realize, and that's the yellow box down there, that Africa, only 30% of the population can actually access a public transportation within 500 to 1,000 meters of their home, which means that 70% cannot, which is a huge amount of people not being able to access public transportation. On average, 1 billion people spend 1 hour walking or cycling in Africa. And that's why it's important to retain the population, but in a safe way, because the rate of death in Africa on the road is much higher than in any other place of the world, even if Africa only accounts for 3% of the world's registered vehicles. So there is a lot of I think, opportunities for us to actually join forces and try to improve the situation in a much more, I think, integrated way in Africa. So the Immobility Program is a program that we launched in UNEP a couple of years ago, mainly with the support of the GEF, but in partnership with many other implementing agencies, banks, and the EU through the EC Solutions. We support around 50 countries that join the program. So the program is organized in the GEF as an umbrella program where you have a coordination kind of global project, and then you have what we call the child projects, the country projects, and the global coordination program has two very strong aspects. We have technical working groups on different models, so four-wheelers, light-duty vehicles, two- and three-wheelers, batteries, and renewable energy grid integration. And we work on these together with the International Energy Agency as well. And we have different actually leads for each of the working groups. And we have representatives that I have already been working on these, and we draw best practices and we share these best practices with our country projects. We also have an innovative approach, what we call the regional support and investment hubs. So for Africa, for Asia, and for Eastern Europe, and for Latin America, we have actually communities of practice, these investment hubs that will congregate the countries in the region that have joined this program, but also will link with whoever is leading that regional and investment platform, work on immobility. So all the learning, all the demonstrations, all the evidence-based policymaking data that has been acquired in that specific region could be shared. And the idea is that, for instance, in Eastern Europe, north of Africa. It's our colleagues from the EBRD who lead the platform, and they are the ones who actually then provide that support and actually help the countries to take some of the projects that need upscaling and funding to a second phase. So we are still in the beginning of the program, so I can't yet show the results. But it's very interesting. The Asian Development Bank have their own platform. The Centro Mario Molina Chile has a one in Latin America, and Europe is leading the one in Africa. So just to give you an idea in terms of the spread of the program, in terms of countries and models of transport, I think it's very small, but you will see that we have mostly 2 and 3 wheelers in Africa, a lot of private electric buses, and there are countries where we're only working on the policy framework to help to enable the transition to e-mobility. I don't know in terms of time, I can talk a little bit more about the Immobility Program, but I imagine I'm already running out of time. But you have my contacts, and the program is going to go to a second phase in GEF8. So countries could actually either change their approach or their modal transport, or they can actually enhance what they are already doing. So whoever is interested on that, please let us know. And we're beginning a discussion on how we're going to actually go to a different phase. We are working on what we call the phase 1, when we have established some pilots with a couple of vehicles. We have enabled legislation. We are having roadmaps for e-mobility transition, and we're working on how we're going to deal with the batteries that will be disposed in the future, so we don't end up with a situation that we have disposed batteries that it's not environmentally safe. And we're doing a lot of capacity building on also grid integration and all the issues related to business models that will allow to break the high upfront costs. Leasing, we thought, was going to be a very good way, especially in capture fleets, but many countries don't have leasing in their way of operating, because that would be a very interesting way of breaking down this cost. So we have to really think hard of very innovative models to do that. And we think that also we learned very recently that basic things actually impede the transition to e-mobility. So a registration of a vehicle, if a country does not have in their books registration of e-vehicles, the whole thing really needs to start from there. Otherwise, we can't register the vehicles. If they had a bad experience with VAT exempts and they have imported hybrid vehicles and it didn't work, there is a lot of resistance to actually change legislation again. So there are a lot of small things that we think are not important, but if they're not sorted out, then the market cannot be enabled to the transition to e-mobility. But going back to phase 2, phase 2 is where we need 200, 300 e-buses on the road. We need a complete change of 2 and 3 wheelers. We need private and capture fleets to change. And why we need to focus on these first? Because if you think about the buses, electric buses, 2 and 3 wheelers, and capture fleets, the charging infrastructure will be concentrated on the depots, and they will be concentrated in the houses of the people who actually drive the 2 and 3 wheelers. And it's a very easy charging. You don't have to have a charging infrastructure. And in the depots, it's much easier to charge. If you need to charge the whole infrastructure within the country, that transition is much more complicated and costly. And we have to ask ourselves, it will happen, but how much we want to foster that to happen? Because again, we're going to promote the more use of private vehicles. So there must be a balanced approach. But going back to the need of having BRTs that are electrified, we're thinking of teaming up with the World Bank. The World Bank will establish a 1 billion fund to decarbonize low transport in Africa. And we are in discussions on how we can team up with them and maybe propose a project to the GCF along these lines. One of the things that we need to sort out is how to to address the differential cost of electric buses, because this is, I think, one of the things that is most needed if we really want to have a good transition in Africa. And again, there is going to be a phase 3, maybe into 2035, 2040, where there is going to be a complete phase out of conventional vehicles. And I think we will all see it. And so we're part of what is happening. And I think it's very exciting. We are just a small part of the puzzle in UNEP, and we need the support of other partners. And there is a lot of people working on e-mobility, and we're looking for opportunities for partnerships, not only for GFA, but also for the GCF. So thank you very much, and I'll stop here.
Okay, thank you, Ruth, for a very insightful and interesting the presentation. So with that one, so now let me request the Oscar from the CAF about the presentation on his project. So let me also highlight this project is under consideration of the board in the October, and this is one of the very interesting project because Oscar will highlight more detail about this, but this has gone through several the modification, and also it has evolved a lot from the origination until at this stage. So this is one of the very interesting projects that I find. So it's over to you, Oscar, please.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Oscar Guevara. I work for CAF, the Latin America Development Bank. Apologies for my strong Latino accent, but we also Latinos try to speak very fast, so sometimes people don't understand my broken English. As Naresh already mentioned, we are still fighting to bring this project to the upcoming B34 that will happen in 1 month. So you are all familiar about how GCF works. So we are in the middle of trying to bring this to hopefully a decision that is in favor of this project. But well, with that introduction, the project is called eMotion. That is a program that is aiming to accelerate electric mobility in Latin America. Okay. Do I need to use? Okay. Okay, great. So I will be very brief. I will just mention two elements regarding to the project. The first one is just to give you a quick overview, but I will try to focus my presentation on the second component. Is about the paradigm shift and the theory of change that, as Naresh already mentioned, I think it's quite innovative because from my point of view, it really reflects what this theory of change and the transformative view that the GCF has towards the transportation sector. Well, as usually, we start these projects describing the climate rationality. So this is a mitigation project. Latin America is accountable for around close to 10% of global greenhouse gas emissions. Out of this 10%, 45% of the emissions in Latin America are somehow linked to the transport sector. And well, the figures are somehow hard to see. But electric mobility, globally speaking, is about 4.6% of the total amount of vehicles that are in the world. In Latin America, that percentage is so much lower compared to that 4% that is global. Here in Latin America is much less than 1%. So comparing to what is happening in Latin America and the global context, there is a big opportunity to actually scale up and introduce a larger number of electric vehicles, both in public and private transportation. And of course, there is also a big opportunity to introduce measures that actually reduce the amount of greenhouse gas emissions in Latin America, especially because in the majority of countries, the energy produced in order to generate the sources used to produce electricity in Latin America came from renewable sources. So this is probably the most important slide in the presentation, because there are 6 elements that are the foundation of this project. So the first one is that the first barrier is the limited know-how on electromobility in the countries. This is something that is changing in the last years, but somehow there is in Latin America is limited understanding about the potential and the need for better regulation in order to introduce electric mobility. So this is one of the barriers that this project is tackling, is facing directly, is how we can support countries in order to create a better regulatory environment in order to promote electric mobility. The second one are technological limitations. We know that technology exists in order to scale up and introduce a lot more options for electric mobility in all countries in Latin America. But unfortunately, this technology transfer is not happening fast enough. So this is another barrier that we are trying to face directly, is how we can speed up this technology transfer. The third one here is acquisition practices. Is that how we can work together, how we can partner with the owner of bus fleets or with the owners of the different modalities of transportation, that instead of buying new buses that are based on conventional, how to say it in English? Well, the gas fuel electric buses, instead of buying them, go for the option of buying electric buses. So that's one of the barriers, how we can talk with a sector that traditionally for the last 50 years have been working on internal combustion vehicles and shift into another one. So that's another barrier that is important. The fourth one is finance. Again, it's difficult also to transform or to overcome the barriers that the potential customers or the potential companies that are demanding this kind of products will face if they want to access financial products in order to transform their bus fleets and how to, for example, developing charging stations, etc. So one of the things that this project is doing, and this is, for example, one of the things that I think CAF as a development bank is very proud to contribute, is that we can reduce the financial barriers actually to mobilize climate finance in order to speed up the way this type of technologies is being introduced. So how we are offering or being able to, together with GCF, to offer better conditions to access to these technologies. And when I say better conditions, talking about better financial conditions. So that's one of the barriers that also this project is addressing. The other one is institutional limitations. The speaker that, sorry, I forgot the name, from UNEP that presented before me, well, she made a clear distinction that there are different national circumstances in Latin America regarding to the adoption of electric mobility, importing vehicles, used vehicles, etc. And basically, this is something that this project also is very much aware and is trying to address, is how we can reduce to the maximum possible these limitations that institutions have. And also there is a lot of complexity between the different ministries of transport, authorities, regulatory schemes, etc., that are in place in Latin America. But we are aware of that. And this is why, for example, I mentioned at the very beginning of the session that this is one of the transformative changes that need to happen, and that we are fully embracing with this project. And the last one is the installment of pilot projects. And within this approach, the eMotion project, we know that there are initiatives all around, not only Latin America, in the world, that try to pilot electric mobility. But I think that within this project, we try to move from these pilot phases to actually to scale up these initiatives, actually to go for the big target, or to go for actually the amount of financial resources are to go for the amount of countries that actually can start moving into that direction. And when I mention the scale is because eMotion, or this project that is targeting e-mobility and low carbon transportation, it consists in two sister projects. One is the presented by AFD, the French Agency of International Cooperation, and the other one is presented by us. But actually, they two belong to the same program. And together, we are covering, but what you can see here, 11 countries, Latin America. And we are both presenting in B34, hopefully, fingers crossed. And this is what I mentioned, the importance actually to going into the big picture of how we can move forward electric mobility in Latin America. There are 4 components. Actually, well, here it says 5, but it's 4. So the first one, each component is actually addressing one of the main barriers and one of the main elements of the theory of change that this project has. And I think this will be my last slide, being aware of time. But the first one is how to support countries to establish an e-mobility environment or ecosystem, as sometimes we call it. So that ecosystem consists of national regulators, the owners of the bus fleets, the users, the providers of energy, the communities, of course, and all together, how we can mobilize all these stakeholders in order to establish a positive or an enabling ecosystem in order to actually consolidate electric mobility in the 11 countries. The component 2 is the deployment of large-scale e-buses fleets. So, and again, it's just moving away from the concept of small pilot programs and actually providing the financial resources to deploy large-scale e-buses fleets. So we are just trying to, again, have a big impact on the 11 countries that we are working. So just, I think we in CAP and also I think the GCF shares this vision that we have the capacity to move from small pilot projects on e-mobility to go for the large scale approaches and actually consolidate electric mobility in the region. Component number 3 is, of course, it's not only about buses, but also there's the possibility to introduce commercial vehicles, small commercial vehicles that are used especially by small and medium enterprises. So this is also another component that is that comes together with public transportation is the option that has these commercial vehicles. And the third one is the infrastructure needed for recharging. For recharging all these electric vehicles. So it is not only the recharging stations, but also the infrastructure that connects these charging stations with the whole network that provides energy to the countries. And also the post-consume use of these batteries. This is also very important. This is highlighted in all the environmental social safeguards of the project, but actually it's also an opportunity because these batteries can use we have developed and proposed many ideas for post-consumption use, but definitely many of them are targeting the public sector. So these batteries can be used to illuminate public spaces. It can be used in libraries and this kind of public buildings that do not require the efficiency that is needed in the commercial vehicles. So somehow these are or can be used as backup or to store energy in public buildings, for example. I mean, it's a very complicated scheme, but this is being addressed in component 4. Well, and the last one is all the system that needs to be put in place, as you can imagine, to monitor, report, and verify the results of these initiatives that from CAP's component comprises 3 countries, but altogether with the AFD project will be 11 countries. So, well, I think I can, well, just to mention part of the financial description of the project. Well, PA means Panama. The second column, PY, is Paraguay, and the third one is Uruguay. And well, it is a kind of complicated financial scheme, but just to mention that the project so far is about $240 million, including finance and co-finance. One of the things is that we are requesting the GCF $7.74 million. There is a big element of co-finance that is being done by CAF. We as a development bank actually are putting this program of e-mobility as a priority for us. We strongly believe on the opportunity, but also on the positive impact that this project can have in the region. So actually, the amount of co-finance that we are putting into this initiative is comparative with the GCF is larger. But well, I think you can see the numbers here about the balance between how much GCF is putting into the project in terms of loan. So, for example, in Paraguay, GCF's loan is 20 million and CAF's is 36. In Paraguay, it's 31, the loan from GCF, and we are putting 57 millions. And in Uruguay, it's $15 million, the GCF, and we are putting 28. So that's the average rate that between finance and co-finance that is being put together for this project. I think a round of, okay. So no, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Oscar, for this very insightful presentation on the very innovative project. So all the best for your project, finger crossed. It's in the B34 next year in October. So we hope that, okay, we will get through with this project. So with that, we conclude our presentation from our panelists. So you may post your the questions on the Hooper app, or you can also raise it here if you have any questions on that. But before going to the Q&A session, I would like to suggest to our technical team, the IT, maybe for the next session, you need to adjust the screen because the speaker cannot read from here. So they need to always look it back. So maybe you need to adjust this one for the next sessions. So that's so if there are any questions, please, colleagues, they feel free to raise. We will take it up. You can also put it here in person as well. So before going to that, let me just pose one questions to both Ruth and Oscar, particularly for the Africa and the Latin American region. Because if you look at the situation or the stage of the e-mobility in different regions and different countries are very different. And some countries are advanced, some regions are advanced. Most probably the Latin America is a bit more advanced than the other regions. But what I would like to, from your the presence and also from your perspective and the experience, how do you see in next 10 years of the horizon of the time, how do you see the scaling up of these projects, particularly in the Latin America and the Africa region? So with the Latin America, I'll hand it over to Oscar, please.
I think that it's happening. I mean, it's not theoretical anymore. I think that almost all multilateral development banks have a program on electric mobility. We are not the exception, and of course we want to do it right. And that's why we decided to partner with GCF, because it's not only about the transport sector is seen as a traditional economic sector, but also the positive impact that this can have on the environment and in the quality of life of people. Because I forgot to mention this, but by introducing electric mobility, we are not only reducing greenhouse gas emissions, but also we have a significant positive impact on pollution, on air pollution. And that's a big issue, especially in Latin America, when close to 80% of people lives in cities. Some people is not aware that Latin America is the most urbanized region in the world. And by doing so, we are moving forward into the direction, not only of that we see ourselves as becoming the green bank of Latin America, but also we believe that this is something that needs to be adopted as fast as possible. Because again, considering that our energy matrix is somehow based in the majority of countries on renewable energy. So that put us in a very good position to actually quickly adopt these kind of technologies and to scale them as soon as possible.
Okay. Thank you, Oscar. I think this is quite informative and also very interesting. Ruth, over to you for the Africa region with your experience and the presence.
No, thank you. I think that for both regions, one of the most important things is to get the commitment of the major producers to adopt the same policies of not producing conventional cars with a time frame that allows the developing countries to actually leapfrog to a situation of that will enable the acceleration of the uptake of electric mobilities in Latin America and in Africa. Mainly in Latin America, some countries already are banning exports, but I think it would be also important. There is big lobbies of the automotive industry in countries like Brazil that will actually hamper the scalability, the fast scalability of that. So producers that actually are committed to immobility in Europe, they lobby against immobility in some countries, in Brazil, for instance, but probably in other countries as well. In Africa, what I see in 10 years is it all depends on how I think the environment of donors will support the shift to electric buses and to the electrification of the BRT systems. A lot of capitals that have a lot of congestion and a lot of pollution will have the BRTs. If the BRTs can be electrified and we can actually put buses and feeder lines, because it's very important never to forget the feeder lines and the last mile connectivity. If it's an integrated approach, I think that the regulatory environment will be much more willing to change in Africa rather than in Latin America. So the conditions will be different. And I see a lot of potential in Africa if we actually can actually address the issue of high upfront costs. There is a whole ecosystem that I think my colleague explained in a much better way that needs to be tackled. And if you don't tackle all the aspects of immobility, then you are not going to be able to really have a robust and accelerated shift.
Thank you, Ruth. It was very insightful, I think. So the audience, if you have any questions, I think you can ask now, and we can have the question taken up, because there is no questions at the moment. I do not see anything here. So if you have any questions, please feel free to raise your hand. Okay, please, over to you.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm Sateta from the Fiji Development Bank, and I think in 2018, around about 2018, 2017, we had actually been talking about introducing decarbonizing the public bus transport in Fiji. And we had presented to GCF in sessions like this, but we've held back this submission of the concept note purely because we were not comfortable as a development bank because of some data that we needed to comfortably support the project to GCF. However, having said that, of late, we've now worked with the NDA, and the government has decided to do a pilot. So we are doing we've just completed the feasibility study, and it's just doing a pilot around the city area to then establish how we can then scale this up. So, but from the bank's perspective, while we're waiting for the outcome of that pilot, we've now worked with a private sector company to try and introduce the charging station. So I just wanted to provide this as an update. What we are doing right now, we've just approved a loan, and it's really to an SME company that will introduce the charging station, and they've already installed 2 in the city of Suva. And we are now going to do another 2 on another property. and the charging station is actually going to be sort of solar operated. So one of the questions that I had really was around trying to finance this this SME. We realized that they could not provide us the security that we needed. So what would maybe with the Development Bank of Latin America, if they have any suggestions to us on how we can address that? I know that leasing was suggested as one of the financial instrument that could be used. We are actually exploring that, but at this point in time, because we don't have a big portfolio, the bank decided let's just do it as an asset-based lending. So with that asset-based lending, then the challenge is this SME cannot provide us the collateral we need. And if any thoughts and suggestions around that, thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Well, I intentionally didn't include in the presentation the different financial schemes that are being developed for this. For two reasons. The first one is that the project is still not approved, so that can be a little bit risky to talk about that element. The second one is that the financial scheme is really complicated because there are many options that were considered and actually were put in place in order to make this project real. But for you, then last two takeaway messages. The first one is that we are a regional development bank for Latin America. So this project, we also operate through local banks. That's one thing. And through local banks that we have a long-term relationship. So we are used to operate with them, and we know the conditions that usually, and their expertise in certain regions and in certain sectors, etc. So that's one thing. And the second one is that the reason why also we work with the GCF is the opportunity actually to provide competitive finance, but also in sectors that are risky for traditional banking. That, for example, is not our business as usual way of operating. That if we are not partnering with GCF, will be difficult also for us because we are also innovating in our way of working. I mean, we haven't done this before, but we are learning together with the GCF, and this is also why, well, this project has been in development for 2 years, because we are also trying to find the right mechanisms internally to put in competitive financial terms what we are promising to do. So it needs to be competitive the way we finance to build electric charging stations. It needs to be competitive the way we offer financial instruments to buy bus fleets or to buy electric light vehicles in 3 countries through local institutions. So this is why we work a lot with the GCF, because every financial element of the project not also needs to be well supported by GCF, but we need to make sure that it's competitive in ground, where it will be implemented. Otherwise, well, we will not do it. So again, I really like your question, but unfortunately, the answer is very complicated. But once we get approved, we will disclose the proposal, and of course we can follow up later. We can exchange cards, but because it is complicated, but it takes time, it takes patience, but it is a long-term effort. We really believe that this will be only the first of many projects that will come with GCF or actually with our own financial resources. But definitely this is something that is here and then will stay for a long time.
Okay, thanks, Oscar. Saurabh, would you like to highlight some of from your perspective?
Yeah, so, to reply to your specific question, so, the concern that you have, that you can't value the collateral. You can't only rely on the charging station as a guarantee. So that this is faced by institutions across the globe. And I think the instrument that you could probably explore, and during the morning presentation, I did mention about credit guarantees and how we are deploying credit guarantees to, address credit risks that local banks face in the DRE sector, the distributed RE sector. So similarly, those kind of instruments where you have a high risk perception, you cannot value the collateral on your own. You want recourse to the balance sheet, and sponsors will not give you recourse to the balance sheets. In these kind of situations, a credit guarantee works, and GCF has a product to address these barriers. So,
Yeah.
My answer is not financial because UNEP is not a financial institution, but we're working with Fiji, actually, UNEP and GGGI, the Green Growth Institute. And I think that there is an interest in Fiji to join the GEF8 Electric Mobility Program. And there will be a grant program, and some of the challenges that need evidence-based because of the technology or evidence that the leasing is working before you are able to actually deploy a financial mechanism can be integrated in GEF projects. GEF has much more appetite for risk because it's a grant instrument.
Thank you, Ruth. Okay, please.
I joined a little late, so maybe the question I'm going to ask was discussed earlier. I'm Jafar Raza. I'm from GS Bank, Pakistan. So regarding this particular area, we see a lot of work being done at the government level in Pakistan, and it's mostly for public transportation. However, but the private sector is much more agile and much more active in terms of exploring possibilities to set up the charging stations or converting or onboarding much more energy efficient trucks for interprovincial movements, and motorway operators willing to put up charging stations across there, just like fuel stations. In that particular scenario, what I would like to pick up minds of the panel in terms of what kind of structures or what kind of, or do we have a template in other markets where private sector was much more active, available to perhaps partly cover the exposure, banks willing to take some kind of risk exposure. Was there any kind of intervention from GCF to work with private sector? Thank you.
Okay, Saurabh, would you like to take up this?
Yeah, so I think the presentation that I gave, so we have approved one funding proposal in the e-mobility sector targeting private capital, but that is, the whole proposal is about creating a new entity which does only EV financing and only EV leasing, or provide leasing or financing solutions to other actors. Now, consider your specific question is what is the product that is needed. So see, right now I think the biggest risk that we see from a commercial bank side in this market is how do you value the collateral, and what will be the value of the collateral 3 years from now, because the technology cost is coming down and there's no secondary market. So there could be a specific product, for those kind of risks, but then these risks will change, because the market is very nascent. After 3 years, 5 years, these risks would change, and the requirement could be of some other financial product. So depending upon which phase are we entering, what's the financial ecosystem in the country, does the for example, in many countries, liquidity is not an issue, but ability to take risks, risk appetite is low. So there different products work. In some markets, the bank's balance sheets itself they're very shallow. So you need to provide capital to banks so that they can on-lend. So depending upon local context and financial system construct, solutions will be different.
Okay, thank you, Saurabh. So we are just over 5 minutes with our session. So we will conclude it now if there are no more questions. So before concluding, so the major takeaway of this session is the next decade is the electrification of the transport. That's for sure. So because in all the regions, everything is going on. So if that happens, I think within next 1 to 2 decades, transport is the electrification. So I think that's quite interesting. So with that, let's give a round of applause to our speakers, and thank you so much for your attention.